All right, so today we'll be looking at the American Homefront Part 1. So based on last week, we know that the U.S. is officially involved into World War II on December 7th of 1941. Pearl Harbor, a military base, gets attacked that's located in Hawaii. The next day, FDR calls it a date which will live in infamy. He asks Congress for war. Congress declares war, and as a result, the United States officially enters into World War II. At the start of the war, FDR kind of becomes famous for this quote, and you don't need to write this down. This is just kind of to give you an overview of what sort of he was thinking. And he says, I never wanted to have to fight this war on two fronts. We haven't got the Navy to fight in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. We will have to build up the Navy and Air Force, and that will mean we will have to take a good many defeats before we can have victory. Even though we know that the U.S. was definitely neutral, they weren't necessarily prepared to go to war at the time that they actually went. Even during the Four Freedoms speech, which had taken place 11 months before Pearl Harbor, FDR is kind of warning the American people, hey, we're probably going to have to get involved in some point. But even like the Pearl Harbor attack was a little bit of a surprise and kind of forced the U.S. to get involved a lot quicker than expected. Not only are they going to be fighting the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean, they're also going to be helping out the British and the French because at this point, the U.S., without question, they're going to join the Allied powers. So when he's talking about the Atlantic, he's talking about fighting, specifically the Germans. The Italians are more involved in other places, but mostly the German Navy, they're going to be fighting in the Atlantic Ocean. So he's telling people, listen, we're going to lose quite a bit before we actually we really see kind of any sort of victory. So be prepared for that. Like, yes, Pearl Harbor has happened. We know that morale is down in the country. Just know we're going to lose a little bit, maybe probably for a few months before we see any sort of victory or kind of reap any of the benefits of the war because we weren't prepared to go to war. So he really is kind of trying to be as honest with the American people, but at the same time try to kind of boost their morale. Because in the end, he says, before we can have a victory, like, hey, victory's coming. It might be a while, but we're definitely going to get there. So obviously now that the U.S. is officially involved in, officially involved in World War II, the U.S. is going to kind of start preparing. But we know that the U.S. kind of starts preparing a little bit even before, Pearl Harbor, and that really is going to come after the fall of France. In June of 1940, when France officially falls to the Germans, the U.S. kind of like takes a step back and is like, hey, this isn't good. And again, FDR really reflects on that in that Four Freedom speech of like, listen, the British are like kind of like our last ally that's really standing. They're sort of the last thing standing between, democracy and dictatorships. If something goes wrong, we're going to have to get involved. So the U.S. was well aware that they would get involved in the war at some point. The question was when. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but with Pearl Harbor, you get a lot of conspiracy theories that the U.S. intentionally let Pearl Harbor happen so that way they had an excuse to get involved in the war. Whether or not you believe in conspiracy theories, that's kind of up to you, but you do get a lot of conspiracy theories with Pearl Harbor because of that. But for the most part, the U.S., I would say in a physical sense, like in terms of like men going to war, weren't necessarily prepared, but they were prepared in terms of kind of like industry and things like that. And so what the federal government is going to do is they're going to give industry an incentives. So that way businesses can make money from the war. And this is where we kind of start to see that war becomes a very lucrative business for people in which they can make a lot of money. And I mentioned this several times. War is very bloody. It's very deadly, but it's also very expensive. And war does give people the opportunity to make a lot of money. And the way that the U.S. is going to kind of like give an incentive to businesses is by issuing them cost plus contracts. An incentive is a reason to do something. So the example I like to give students is this. If I gave you a project and I said I wasn't going to grade it, would you guys do it? And most of you say no. And I always go, why not? Kids are like, I'm not going to do it because you're not going to grade it. So what's the point? I then tell you, hey, I'm going to give you this project. It is 60% of your grade. Would you do it? And most of you go, yes. And they go, why? They're like, well, it's 60% of our grade. That is an incentive. An incentive is a reason to do something. Businesses are in the business of making money, right? That's the entire point of a business existing. It's to make a profit. It's to make money. And so the U.S. government sort of realizes we've got to give an incentive to these businesses to want to make money for us. So they're going to issue cost plus contracts. So businesses would not bid against each other. That was sort of the goal. A government would pay a company whatever it costs plus a guaranteed profit. So, let's just say I ran Ford and it cost me in 1942 $10,000 to make a car. And then I would sell it, let's say, for like $12,500. The U.S. government would offer me $15,000 for that car, so it was a guaranteed profit. Because I'm in the business of making money, I'm like, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take that deal. That's essentially what a cost plus contract was, is we're going to pay you for the cost of what it is to make whatever it is that you make and then some. And the more a company produced, the more money they made. So if I know I'm going to get $15,000 for every car I would make, guess what? I'm going to try to produce as many cars as I possibly can. And this is really going to ramp up production for the U.S. war. Obviously, people aren't making cars necessarily, but they're making things like tanks, artilleries, helmets, things like that. The auto industry was already set up for mass production, which is one of the reasons that I use Ford as an example, is because they were already in the business of making cars. Instead of now making cars, they're going to go ahead and just make tanks. And they'll also produce Jeeps as well and trucks, because again, those things are going to be very useful, especially during the war. And the key to winning the war could easily move supplies to the troops. And we're going to kind of see this especially a lot throughout World War II, is that the side that has the most supplies, or at least the side that has like the most resources, is going to be the side that wins. And you kind of notice that like once we get to 1945, which is the end of the war, especially with Germany and Japan, they lacked resources. So the fact that the U.S. especially was ramping up production consistently and making sure that their men had things like tanks, like weapons, like trucks, like Jeeps, like anything that was necessary for the war, it's definitely going to come in handy in terms of winning. If you notice, production's ramping up. Well, weren't we in a Great Depression? Well, this is exactly what's going to pull us out of that Great Depression, because the U.S. is ramping up production so much so, and everybody's making so much money. Hey, guess what? We're officially going to get pulled out of the Great Depression. Does that mean that the debt is going to increase? Yes, absolutely. World War II doesn't officially get paid off until like the 1970s. But because of, the ramping up of production, this is officially going to put people back to work, and it's also going to pull the United States out of the Great Depression. And as you can see here, tank production ramps up quite significantly. In 1941, you have about 4,200 tanks that are produced. By the time you get to 1943, nearly 30,000 tanks are getting produced. You'll notice it starts to go down, especially by 1945, because in 1945, World War II is officially going to come to an end. But of course, tanks, Jeeps, trucks, all very important, right? Definitely necessary. But we know that there's a lot more that's definitely needed for the war effort. These factories are going to build artillery. They're going to build rifles. So these are any type of weapons that the men might need when fighting the war. They'll build mines. They'll also have helmets, because obviously you need helmets. Pontoon bridges, as well as sort of cooking pots, because again, most of the time they're kind of just out in the middle of nowhere, and you cook with what it is that you got. What exactly is a pontoon bridge? It's basically kind of like a makeshift boat. So it's kind of like one of those like makeshift ones, almost kind of like those boats that have like the cars on them, and like it kind of like makes a bridge for like the cars to sort of like get across the bridge. And that's probably like not the best example, but you can kind of probably think of it. But think of a pontoon as kind of like just like a makeshift bridge in order to get people from like one place to another, typically across water. That's sort of what you're looking at. You're also going to have an Air Force that really comes into play, especially in World War II. I've also mentioned this a couple of times. Planes are built in the early 1900s, where that's when aircraft starts to come into play. And in World War I, we really see the modernization of, technology and of modern warfare. So at the start of World War I, people were fighting on horses, but by 1918, people were going out on planes. So when World War II comes about, 20 years later, everyone had an Air Force, and it was really important for people to build a strong Air Force. The B-24 bomber is going to be one of the most popular ones that the United States built. It's called the Liberator. If you notice, that's very intentional. A lot of the names that either ships are going to get or even planes typically have to do with things that we're fighting for. So the Liberator, we're liberating people to freedom, or we're liberating them from the constraints of dictatorships under Mussolini and Hitler and Hideki Tojo in Japan. So those names are going to be very intentional. Even today, most like naval ships or warships, it's like the USS Maine or the USS Arizona, which was the ship that went down in Pearl Harbor, or they're named after presidents and major generals, things like that. Again, those names are very much intentionally picked. You're also going to have basic cargo ships that are going to be used during the war. They're going to call these Liberty ships. Again, that name is very intentionally picked. Like, hey, these ships aren't just ships. They're fighting for liberty. They're fighting for freedom for all. So therefore, they are super, super, super important, to this fight for democracy. Again, it's propaganda, very intentionally picked. One of the benefits of these Liberty ships or these basic cargo ships, they were cheap, they were easy to build, and they were very difficult to sink. And because the U.S.'s Navy, especially out in the Pacific Ocean against the Japanese, they're going to be fighting primarily in the water. It was really important for the United States to build ships that were going to be, tough to sink, that were going to be able to get the job done. And these Liberty ships or basic cargo ships were definitely come into major play. And of course, the building an army, you could have all the tanks, all the jeeps, all the artillery, all the helmets that you want. If you don't have men to fight, it's only going to do so much good. Kind of like similar to World War I, that when the men went off to basic training, it was just for 8 weeks. In World War I, they got 6 weeks. In World War II, they ended up getting 8 weeks. Some people say this dispels rumors about whether or not Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy, because they're like, hey, if it was a conspiracy, wouldn't they have given the men more time to train? But again, it kind of just comes down to your personal belief. Initially, there weren't enough supplies because, again, by the time 1941, at the end of 1941, when World War II is officially declared, it was kind of a bit of a surprise that, like, we're going to be going off to war officially. So, they were getting men in as quickly as possible. They're trying to get weapons and things built as quickly as possible. And again, it's why FDR says, hey, we're going to experience defeat before we finish, before we get any sort of victory, because it's going to take us time to definitely get there. And of course, one of the big things with the men, especially in the military, is going to be about this building of relationships. I really like this quote where it says, the reason why you storm the beaches is not patriotism or bravery. It's that sense of not wanting to fail your buddies, right? It's kind of like fighting for your brother. If you've ever met anyone who's like served in the military, they definitely have like this brotherhood, this this friendship that exists, with all levels. And whenever like guys like that get together, they always tell sort of old stories and they reminisce about, both the good and the bad. We'll be watching Saving Private Ryan in 2 weeks, and that really is a film that kind of looks at that sense of like brotherhood and just like the relationships that the men form, whether good or bad, and just the ups and the downs that they go through, because what these guys experience in the war, nobody else is going to experience in that. And we all know that when a lot of soldiers come back, they have a difficult time adjusting. A lot of these guys suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They kind of have a hard time, coming back to sort of civilian life. A friend of mine, she just got married, and her husband has served 11 years in the Marines. He's done 6 tours, and so he's not going to be doing tours anymore. But, she's like, it's been a bit of an adjustment for him, like adjusting to the civilian life, because she's like, there's things that you could say to guys in the military that you can't necessarily say to somebody like in the middle of Lowe's. So it is an adjustment for these guys to come back, but those relationships that they build with one another are quite important. And of course, paying for the war is also going to be quite expensive. So the federal government is going to spend more than $300 billion. That is a lot of money. In today's money, you're looking at well over $1 trillion. As I mentioned, World War II isn't officially going to get paid off until the 1970s, but until then, the U.S. government's like, hey, how exactly is it that we're going to pay for this war? Well, the first idea was to raise taxes, right? That's kind of the easiest way to pay for anything. The way that the government makes money is taxes. So if you raise taxes on people, therefore you can collect more money to pay for more things. However, that's only going to cover about 45% of the cost of war. So the government's like, we got to come up with something else. Where they're going to issue what we call war bonds. So what exactly is a bond? A bond is basically a loan that you pay. Let me rephrase that. So a bond comes from the government. So if you wanted to buy, say, like a home or a car, you would take out a loan from a bank or from an auto dealership. When the government issues a bond, it's basically you taking out a loan for the government. So the government's basically going to pay you with interest to let them borrow money from you. I would say bonds aren't necessarily a big thing like today, not with your generation, but like I know when I was born in 89, that was like a thing. Your grandparents would buy you bonds. And when I was 18, I cashed the bonds that my grandparents had bought me because I made interest on them. And I was able to get help like pay for my first car with those bonds. So that's essentially what a bond is. It's a way for you, a normal citizen, to lend the government money. And then later you can cash in that bond with interest. So it's kind of like a reverse loan. So like when we need loans, again, for homes or cars, we go to the bank. when the government needs money, they kind of were like, hey, why don't you buy this bond and we'll pay you back, say, 10 years down the line with interest. So that way we have some money. And war bonds became like a very, I would say, positive way of like sort of supporting the war effort. So like even if you're not fighting overseas, you could buy a war bond and you were like considered doing your part. And of course, the government's going to use propaganda and its information, especially of a bias or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Propaganda always gets used, right? There's no question about that. Whether it's for a good cause or a bad cause, whatever it is, in order to get people to support an effort, governments are always going to produce propaganda. War bonds are propaganda. Join the war is propaganda. Famous Uncle Sam, like, I want you to join the U.S. Army. That is propaganda. Propaganda is just like anything that wants you to do something. Whether it's good or bad, propaganda is always going to exist. And here are a couple of like propaganda posters that were created during World War II. So you see a woman here saying, this is my fight, excuse me, this is my fight too. Put at least 10% every payday into war bonds. So we know that at this time, women really aren't serving in the war. If they are, it's typically as nurses, very stereotypical roles. But in terms of sort of fighting out in the fields, right, it doesn't necessarily happen. So here's a woman, even though she's not fighting overseas, she can certainly be doing her part by buying war bonds. So her saying, this is my fight too, is again, just because you're not overseas fighting doesn't mean you can't do what everyone else is doing, or at least do your part. This here, little Hulk Hogan vibes, doing all you can, brother, buy war bonds. So you can see here that we have like an injured soldier. He's kind of out in like the middle of nowhere. We notice that he's definitely been injured. You can tell based on like the bandage and the blood that's on it. So, he's kind of almost like guilt tripping people. Like, are you doing all you can? Like, if you're not over here fighting with us, like, are you definitely doing your part to help out with the war effort? So again, buying war bonds is an effort to be like, hey, you need to help out with the war effort. If I had a helmet, maybe I wouldn't have gotten injured, and the only way that we can produce more helmets is with more money. So therefore, you should buy more war bonds. You also have this one here, Keep Us Flying, buy war bonds. So here is a gentleman who is a part of the Air Force. Again, he wants to be flying, to kind of help take down the Germans, help take down the Italians, help take down the Japanese. The only way that they could do that is if they're in an airplane. He's clearly not in an airplane. The only way that he's going to be able to get an airplane is if you help to buy war bonds. So again, it's a little, it's definitely trying to guilt trip people like, hey, if you're not doing your part, here's how you can.